Welcome to Read Aloud. I'm Dan. We're reading today The Right of Nations to Self-Determination by Lenin. This is from 1913. Today we're reading Chapter 3. The concrete features of the national question in Russia and Russia's Bourgeois-Democratic Reformation. In Chapter 3, we understand that this work in general is a polemic against certain treatments of the national question. These are represented by Rosa Luxemburg in her article on the national question. And Lenin, in this work, throughout the whole thing, is, doing the debate bro thing. I don't mean that pejoratively. He's just arguing about very important, very, very important topics with which he disagrees with Rosa Luxemburg, who is a Polish Marxist. In this chapter, Lenin talks about how Rosa was mad. She mad that the Marxist program didn't include certain places where it should, in her mind, support their national movement. But Lenin reminds Rosa that the Marxist national program refers only to bourgeois democratic national movements. So her point's really moot. Then in praising Austrian cultural national autonomy in her article, Rosa says, pretty much says, I'm paraphrasing here, they did fine without it. They did fine without including the rights of nations to self-determination, even though they sort of did. But she does this in an attempt to critique the Russian Marxist program's inclusion of the right of nations to self-determination, which they explicitly needed to include because Russia and their neighbors were in a different stage of national development than Austria and awakening. This is owing to Bolsheviks wanting the oppressed nations within Russia and their neighbors to better understand they were uninterested in simply taking over as their new oppressor. So as you could see, as powers are shifting and a neighboring power goes, hey, we don't want to oppress you. It's right here in our program and we're explicit about it. That sort of makes you look pretty friendly. And that could prove very beneficial down the road. And many argue that that was the case. It was the correct course. Chapter 3. The concrete features of the national question in Russia and Russia's bourgeois democratic reformation. Quote, despite the elasticity of the principle of the right of nations to self-determination, which is a mere platitude, and obviously equally applicable not only to the nations inhabiting Russia, but also to the nations inhabiting Germany and Austria, Switzerland and Sweden, America and Australia, we do not find it in the programs of any of the present-day socialist parties. This is how Rosa Luxemburg opens her attack upon Clause 9 of the Marxist program. That is the clause that includes the right of nations to self-determination explicitly. I want to go back and remind you, she's referring to Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Sweden, America, and Australia. We're keeping that in mind. Lenin says, in trying to foist on us the conception that this clause on the program is a mere platitude, Rosa Luxemburg herself falls victim to this error, alleging with amusing boldness that this point is obviously equally applicable to Russia, Germany, etc. We shall reply. Rosa Luxemburg has decided to make her article a collection of errors in logic that could be used for schoolboy exercises. That is dripping with disdain. I honestly think too much. Because, like, Rosa fucked this up, but, like, she's still cool. Anyways, he says, for Rosa Luxemburg's tirade is sheer nonsense and a mockery of the historically concrete presentation of the question. I think that's a better way. That's a better way to put it. Whole schoolboy exercise. It's just maybe too much disdain for me. Anyways, everyone's a critic. Am I right? Lenin says, if one interprets the Marxist program in a Marxist fashion, not in a childish way, one will without difficulty grasp the fact that it refers to bourgeois democratic national movements. The Marxist program refers to bourgeois democratic national movements. That being the case, it is obvious that this program sweepingly and as a mere platitude, etc., covers all instances of bourgeois democratic national movements. No less obvious to Rosa Luxemburg, if she gave the slightest thought to it, is the conclusion that our program refers only to cases where such a movement is actually in existence. Had she given thought to these obvious considerations, Rosa Luxemburg would have easily perceived that nonsense she was talking. In accusing us of uttering a platitude, she has used against us the argument that no mention is made of the right of self-determination in the programs of countries where there are no bourgeois democratic national movements. A remarkably clever argument. He says. How clever. He says, a comparison of the political and economic development of various countries, as well as of their Marxist programs, is of tremendous importance from the standpoint of Marxism. For there can be no doubt that all modern states are of a common capitalist nature and are therefore subject to a common law of development. But such a comparison must be drawn in a sensible way. The elementary condition for comparison is to find out whether the historical periods of development of the countries concerned, are at all comparable. Can you compare? Can you even compare two nations? What are the conditions under which two nations are comparable? He says. For instance, Lenin says, only absolute ignoramuses, such as Prince Y. Trubetskoy in Russkaya Misl, are capable of comparing the Russian Marxists' agrarian program with the programs of Western Europe, since our program replies to questions that concern the bourgeois democratic agrarian reform, whereas in the Western countries no such question arises. That same logic applies to the national question. In most Western countries, it was settled long ago. It is ridiculous to seek an answer to non-existent questions in the programs of Western Europe. In this respect, Rosa Luxemburg has lost sight of the most important thing: the difference between countries where bourgeois democratic reforms have long been completed and those where they have not. This is his big issue with Rosa. In her analysis, she leaves it out entirely. He says, the crux of the matter lies in this difference. Rosa Luxemburg's complete disregard of it transforms her verbose article into a collection of empty and meaningless platitudes. The epoch of bourgeois democratic revolutions in Western continental Europe embraces a fairly definite period, approximately between 1789 and 1871. This was precisely the period of national movements and the creation of national states. When this period drew to a close, Western Europe had been transformed into a settled system of bourgeois states, which, as a general rule, were nationally uniform states. Therefore, to seek the right to self-determination in the programs of West European socialists at this time of day is to betray one's ignorance of the ABC of Marxism. Or ABCs, I guess, I don't know. In Eastern Europe and Asia, the period of bourgeois democratic revolutions did not begin until 1905. The revolutions in Russia, Persia, Turkey, and China, the Balkan Wars. Such is the chain of world events in our period of our Orient. And only a blind man could fail to see in this chain of events the awakening of a whole series of bourgeois democratic national movements which strive to create nationally independent and nationally uniform states. It is precisely and solely because Russia and the neighboring countries are passing through this period that we must have a clause in our program on the right of nations to self-determination. There it is. There it is. So, your nation, you're in a nation that's like awakening. You're surrounded by conditions that are similar. Farther west in Europe, this process is completed. So their concerns over the national question for themselves are going to be wildly different from the concerns of those nations that are in that process of awakening. And it's precisely because these nations are in this transitional period, and there's a whole big group of them, that the Marxist program includes that right of nations to self-determination. And that turned out to be the right thing to do. Did it not? He says, but let us continue the quotation from Rosa Luxemburg's article a little more. She writes, in particular, the program of a party which is operating in a state with an extremely varied national composition, and for which the national question is a matter of first-rate importance. The program of the Austrian Social Democratic Party does not contain the principle of the right of nations to self-determination. She goes, hey, the Austrian Social Democrats, They're doing a great job. And if you read Marxism and the National Question by Stalin, you know what happens. Narrator, it's not first rate. And she goes, well, they're doing such a great job, and they don't have the principle of the right of nations to self-determination. It's not the big brain argument you think it is, Rosa. Lenin says, thus, an attempt is made to convince the reader by the example of Austria in particular. Let us examine this example in the light of concrete historical facts and see just how it sounds. It sounds childish. I haven't read a lot of Rosa Luxemburg, but this is embarrassing. He says, in the first place, let us pose the fundamental question of the completion of the bourgeois democratic revolution. In Austria, this revolution began in 1848 and was over in 1867. Since then, a more or less fully established bourgeois constitution has dominated for nearly half a century, and on its basis, a legal workers' party is legally functioning. Was this written at a time when it was not legal in Russia? If 1913 specifically wasn't at that time, there were periods when their work was made illegal. We know that. All right. He says, therefore, in the internal conditions of Austria's development, that is, from the standpoint of the development of capitalism in Austria in general, and among its various nations in particular, there are no factors that produce leaps and bounds, a concomitant, that word is incredible, a concomitant of which might be the formation of nationally independent states. He says, in assuming, by her comparison, that Russia is in an analogous position in this respect, Rosa Luxemburg not only makes a fundamentally erroneous and anti-historical assumption, but also involuntarily slips into liquidationism. Secondly, he says, the profound difference in the relations between the nationalities in Austria and those in Russia is particularly important for the question we're concerned with. Not only was Austria for a long time a state in which the Germans preponderated, but the Austrian Germans laid claim to hegemony in the German nation as a whole. This claim, as Rosa Luxemburg, who is seemingly so adverse to commonplaces, platitudes, abstractions, will perhaps be kind enough to remember, was shattered in the War of 1866. The German nation, predominating in Austria, found itself outside the pale of the independent German state, which finally took shape in 1871. On the other hand, the Hungarians' attempt to create an independent national state collapsed under the blows of the Russian serf army as far back as 1849. A very peculiar situation was thus created. A striving on the part of the Hungarians and then of the Czechs, not for separation from Austria, but on the contrary, for the preservation of Austria's integrity, precisely in order to preserve national independence, which might have been completely crushed by more rapacious and powerful neighbors. Owing to this peculiar situation, Austria assumed the form of a dual state, and she is now being transformed into a triple state. he says, transformed into a triple state of Germans, Hungarians, and Slavs. Is that a good thing? I mean, like, no. Makes makes these nations more nationalized. Because of that, it makes international solidarity more difficult in that sense. He says, is there anything like this in Russia? Is there in our country a striving of the subject peoples for unity with the great Russians in face of the danger of worse national oppression? One need only pose this question in order to see that the comparison between Russia and Austria on the question of self-determination of nations is meaningless, platitudinous, and ignorant. The peculiar conditions in Russia with regard to the national question are just the reverse of those we see in Austria. Russia is a state with a single national center, Great Russia. The Great Russians occupy a vast unbroken stretch of territory and number about 70 million. The specific features of this national state are, first, that subject peoples, which on the whole comprise the majority of the entire population, that is 57%, inhabit the border regions. Secondly, the oppression of these subject peoples is much stronger here than in the neighboring states, and not even in the European states alone. Thirdly, in a number of cases, the oppressed nationalities inhabiting the border regions have compatriots across the border who enjoy greater national independence. Suffice it to mention the Finns, the Swedes, the Poles, the Ukrainians, and the Romanians along the western and southern frontiers of the state. This is at a time, you guys, of Imperial Russia, right? Fourthly, the development of capitalism and the general level of culture are often higher in the non-Russian border regions than in the center. Lastly, it is in the neighboring Asian states that we see the beginning of a phase of bourgeois revolutions and national revolutions, which are spreading to some of the kindred nationalities within the borders of Russia. Thus, it is precisely the specific, concrete historical features of the national question in Russia that make the recognition of the right of nations to self-determination in the present period a matter of special urgency in our country. Incidentally, even from the purely factual angle, Rosa Luxemburg's assertion that the Austrian Social Democrats' program does not contain any recognition of the right of nations to self-determination is incorrect. We need only to open the minutes of the Brünn Congress, which adopted the national program, to find the statements of the Ruthenian Social Democrat Hankovich, on behalf of the entire Ukrainian or Ruthenian delegation, and by the Polish Social Democrat Reger, on behalf of the entire Polish delegation, to the effect that one of the aspirations of the Austrian Social Democrats of both the above-mentioned nations is to secure national unity and the freedom and independence of their nations. Hence, while the Austrian Social Democrats did not include the right of nations to self-determination directly in their program, they did nevertheless allow the demand for national independence to be advanced by sections of the party. In effect, this means, of course, the recognition of the right of nations to self-determination. Thus, Rosa Luxemburg's reference to Austria speaks against Rosa Luxemburg in all respects. A little catty right there, I'll be honest. Okay. That's the chapter. It really, in a way, feels like we're like lost in the weeds, but this is, I don't know, it's just important stuff. So in review, again, Rosa mad. The Marxist program didn't include certain places where it supported their national movement. Lenin reminds Rosa the Marxist national program refers to bourgeois democratic national movement, so her point's moved. But in praising Austrian cultural national autonomy, says they seem to have done fine without including the right of nations to self-determination, even though they sort of did. She does this in an attempt to critique the Russian Marxist program's inclusion of the right of nations to self-determination, which they explicitly needed to include because Russia and their neighbors were in a different stage of national development than Austria. That is, an awakening. This is owing to Bolsheviks wanting the oppressed nations within Russia and border regions to better understand they were uninterested in becoming their new oppressors. And this proved, many believe, to be the correct course. What do you think? Sound off below. Okay, and this was a reading and discussion of Chapter 3 of the Right of Nations to Self-Determination. If you enjoy this, feel free to support my content. It means a lot. And if you're watching live, stick around. If you are watching the replay, check out Chapter 4 on practicality in the national question. Practicality, what does that mean? We'll talk about that then. See you then. Love your face.